At the dawn of the age of Gorgons, the great continent was torn asunder, and in place of its once earthy heart was naught but the endless sea. There arose men, the grandchildren of the gods, and fate would set their hands to many great and terrible things. Hi guys, this is Mike Yao with the Savage Kingdoms role-playing game with Fire in the Head Productions. That was a little blurb from the back of the Savage Kingdoms rulebooks. This actually was from the Savage East, one of the books from the original edition. It's also on the back of the original core rulebook, and perhaps more importantly, it's on the back of this baby, this giant baby right here, which is Savage Kingdoms Reforged. So this is sort of the new edition. Well, it's really like a 1.5 edition. I've already done a video about that, so I won't go too much into detail, but basically it's a combination of the original two books of Savage Kingdoms, the core rulebook and the Savage East, which is the campaign expansion guide. It combines both of those books, which is why it's so massive, 474 pages. It's also full color book, full color interior. It runs about $45 on DriveThruRPG, which is pretty amazing because a book that size, full color, should run 55 to 60 bucks. So you can pick it up pretty cheaply right now. In fact, I think it's actually even $1 or $2 less right now if you get it. I lowered the prices to try to get a little more activity going a couple days ago. So this video is about a little bit of background of the campaign. That's why I started with that blurb to kind of take us into the mood, the atmosphere, as it were. So in the core rulebook here on this is pages 6 and 7. See some pretty cool artwork there that's supposed to be pretty evocative. That is chapter 2 of the forward and introduction section. It's called the prologue. So the prologue starts with "At the dawn of the age of Gorgons," that blurb I read, and takes us into the ages of the world. Starting off with the ages of the gods. So basically that's what this video is about. Hopefully it'll only be about 30-35 minutes. This will give new players and game masters a little background about the history of the world. Maybe I'll do some more videos in the future that deal with more aspects of the book, particularly the lore and setting of the world. But this video is about the ages of the history of the world, pretty much in a quick nutshell, bringing us up into present times. Present time being the assumed default time that most Savage Kingdoms campaigns would start, which is 9 years after the Gorgon Wars, which I'll get to in a second. So first of all, we have the Age of Gods. The Age of Gods was assumed to be 13,000 years ago. Assumed by scholars, historians, bards, those people in the know. Some certain sorcerers and priests might have an idea that that's how far back history goes, or it's assumed to go that far back. So the first paragraph of the Age of the Gods, 13,000 years ago, goes like this. In the beginning, the world was filled with gods, deathless beings that mortal races would soon come to worship. These deities knew their power, knew their worth. Proud and wrathful, they fought with one another, battled for control and dominance over the earth world. Eons those wars went on, all but the blink of the eye to the gods, and in the fighting and primal chaos they arose the great mountains and deep valleys of the world. So, first paragraph. So that lets you know that the gods are assumed to have walked the world in physical form. My cats are playing in the background, so I apologize. So they made the valleys from treading or for battling with each other. Or perhaps clove deep into the earth to rent the valleys and ravines and chasms and lakes and eventually rivers of the world. And so yeah, that's a way that the world possibly was created. Now it's not known for sure. Perhaps it was created by the world's even much older, like our real world, and there's more science involved. But that's what people believe, and since this is a fantasy setting, it very well could be truth. But this is a long time, long time ago, way before man, which I'll get to in a second. So that's the age of the gods, 13,000 years ago. The last paragraph of, and this is on page 8 or page 6. No, page 8. It was right in the first place. The last paragraph of the age of gods goes, as with all things, this age would come to pass, as the gods withdrew more and more from the material creation earth world, and so too would the demons and gorgons and others retreat to the shadowy places of the world and its many places beyond. But before all of godkind could leave the mortal stage entirely, there came upon, entirely, there came upon the world a time and era at which even the age of the gods would quake and marvel. So, therefore, now the age of the giants enters into history or prehistory. This was 10,000 years ago, many reckon. Titans and giants and their ill-begotten ilk then sprang into the mortal world, the divine blood of the gods themselves flowing in their brutish veins. For the giants were the direct offspring of the elder deities, their first attempt at human-like creations. Humanoids sprung from the very likeness of the vanity of the first immortals themselves. Some giant kind, like the Titans, were truly blessed, massive in stature and long and mighty of limb. They also enjoyed much of the blinding beauty of the gods, and some would eventually become worshipped by humans when, at last, they would come crawling into the primal world some centuries later. Where the northern giants were cruel and savage and brutal, the southern giants, the Titans, were cultured, honorable, but still deadly in battle. That's the first two paragraphs, actually. My cats are going crazy in the background. So that tells you that in the age of giants, there are really two types of giants, the Titans and the giants, the true giants. Some might believe that they were originally just the same race, or they were from the same race and they divided a little bit. But it's equally agreed upon that they were towering humanoids, and the reason it's agreed upon is because they still exist. In the current age, they're just a lot rarer. As well it should be for the safety of most civilized realms. So the Titans they preferred warmer climes. They settled more in the south of Astagonia, the western continent, and they even crossed the seas, it said, and can be found in the eastern continent of Hassan, and possibly even, well, actually, definitely, and Imanju, particularly northern Imanju, which is the southern sort of African-esque continent. So Titans in the present day are extremely rare. It's really rare to find one. It's a big thing. It's a big deal. Some are buried in the earth, called Earth Titans. They have to be awakened. Others are sea titans or storm titans is really what they're called. I think D&D and some other games call them storm giants, but in Savage Kingdoms they are technically storm titans. In the north, the giants, the true giants, so to speak, are a little more brutish. And they are consist of the frost giants for the most part and the fire giants. And then there are things like trolls and ogre trolls. Ogres are a type of trolls that kind of spawned from them. It is said kind of and Fomorians, sort of a more corrupted, slightly smaller, but still brutish and nasty sort of sub-races of the giants. But the frost giants and the fire giants fought, and the fire giants were eventually driven south. And honestly, they were sort of happy with that because they preferred volcanoes and sort of warmer climes. So they were driven south, mostly into the Blood Rock Mountains where it was very volcanic, and then to Gorgotha, where the frost giants stayed in the north, where they preferred the cold and the ice and the snow. So yeah, and then the Titans, or later on in the Age of Giants, it is said here in the I'm not going to read the whole thing, obviously, but Gorgotha, that, oh yes, the Gorgons were forged. Even the Gorgons into the world, terrible man-beasts who were much more a corrupted form of life than a truly created one. They were forged mostly in secret by the fallen one, Gorgothon, who was ousted from Rodan when it was said that he came into the mortal world stillborn from his mother, the goddess Remega's divine womb. The sea took his deceased body away far away to foreign shores, and there, on the dusky coast of Gorgotha, he was restored to health. Some whispered that he regained life because he was a god and knew not death, but some said that he was nursed by a demon. Whatever the case, the stillborn god dwelt alone, and in his boredom and quest for vengeance, he corrupted the primal forms of life. So basically, the stillborn god Gorgothon was born on the Isle of Rodon. Stillborn, dead. So, as was custom of the ancient Rodonites, which are the early Pridonians, they would throw their deformed children into the sea, or in this case, super deformed, dead, stillborn, dead. They thought throw him in the water, and apparently he would wash ashore on the great peninsula of Gorgotha, on the western coast of Asconia in the southwest, and was somehow mysteriously revived. And so he healed and got older and lived, basically, and he got bored and thought he was going to try to create life. So, but thematically, corrupted evil creatures and savage kingdoms, very much like in Middle Earth lore, that a truly evil, corrupted being, even though it's powerful and it can use great magics and sorceries, it can't really create real life, and that's the theme with Gorgothon. So he dabbled, he captured men, because humans did exist, which I'll get to in a second, did exist. They're very basic and primal right now, living in caves, and they're like at sort of caveman status, sort of Stone Age status, hiding away from the giants and titans, but still slowly learning and becoming more evolved and civilized to some degree, very slowly. So Gorgothon would capture them, and then he would corrupt them, sort of mate them with animals and beasts, and so some horrible stuff going on, and that created the Gorgons. So in Savage Kingdoms, a Gorgon is actually a type, or well, not really a race, but a type of creature, an aberrant type creature that's typically part man, part beast, part some other animal, and sometimes several parts. Such as a manticore is part man, part lion, part bat with the huge bat wings, and some even have scorpion tails. So that's actually 4 types right there. And a minotaur is part bull, part man. A Medusa, because there are many Medusas. There's not just the one Medusa like in Greek mythology, but there's a race, so to speak, of Medusae in Savage Kingdoms, and they are part man or part woman, part snake, and they can petrify men with their horrible glances. So all that lore is fairly standard there, at least. So those are the Gorgons. Some say that centaurs are Gorgons because they're part horse, part man, and satyrs as well, part goat, part man, or part human. And whether that's true or not, because some believe satyrs are also fae or fairies, which we'll get to in a second. But whether that's true or not, no one is quite sure. If it is, the centaurs actually rose kind of beyond this typical sort of evil nature of most Gorgons. Although they're still a little brutish and warlike as well, but they're definitely a little more advanced than the others. Towards the end of this age, mankind entered history here too, at around the same time that Gorgonic creatures were first seen, ravaging and gnashing in their eternal rage, for many a fell Gorgon is comprised of human parts. I just went over that. It was in this age, too, that the Durgar first appeared in the wide world beneath the mountains and volcanoes, or so some have argued. Others claim instead that the dwarves, or Durgar, came into the mortal realms in the age of Fairy, when the other world first crossed paths with our mundane worlds, forged of fire and iron and stone. Perhaps, though, the Durgar themselves would know better the truth of their own history, and being of secretive nature, have kept it hidden for all these eons, such is their way, and so be it their prerogative. As you can tell, the humans were created at this age too. Durgar possibly as well, or maybe later at the age of Fairy. They're very secretive and hidden away, the Durgar or dwarves, so they, who knows, they could have been there for thousands of years before anyone discovered them. So after the age of giants, we get to the age of dragons. I'll read the last paragraph of the age of giants on page 8. From the great sea they first came, like mighty serpents, burrowing up from the depths below to engulf the earth world in their wrath of fire and ice and lightning. Massive of size and thought they were, wielding magic nearly as terrible as the gods, and they called themselves the dragons. So the age of dragons was 7,000 years ago. Age of giants was 10,000. So, it's been 3,000 years. The first Dragons were sea serpents, great worms that burrowed and undulated through the terrible waters like great scaly spears. They ruled supreme in the dragon sea and soon the lesser ocean rivers besides, and even the occasional wandering god gave pass to the mighty drake in its wide-ranging territory. So yeah, you can see there. So the dragons were first sea serpents. They were first worm-like, serpent-like. That's where a lot of times, sometimes they're called serpents. And the word worm and worm, a northern term, exists, and they're all sort of related because at first that's how they were. And so eventually they sprouted wings, some of them, and flew out and dominated the skies and the upper mountain regions and found great lairs inside of caves. And they very much terrorized as they began to evolve. Later in the Age of Dragons, begin to terrorize even giants and the titans, the ones that were left, and men. Fortunately, men were beginning to humans were beginning to evolve to some degree, and though they hid from dragons for the most part, occasionally a band of tribal band of men might get along and get together and actually take out a younger dragon. So that was not unheard of. In the current age of Savage Kingdoms, the Age of Man, which eventually we'll get to in here in a few moments, not many dragons are still alive. There's, in fact, only 6 or 7 named dragons of any kind of note. There's definitely some younger ones. Dragons, too, it should be noted here that they are without gender. They just have one gender. It's male and female both, or neither. Or I guess it's both. They have the power to create life. They can, dragons can lay eggs, because again, they're generalists, but they all are capable of fertility and life-giving powers. Eggs are massive, that's all fairly standard, typical dragon lore, I think. They can only do it 2 or 3 times in a lifetime, fortunately, for men and other civilized people who would be destroyed and eaten by dragons. So that's just a little sidebar that might be kind of interesting. In fact, there is a little bit of lore that some believe there's not a lot, if anything, written about it. It may just be handed down orally in the Savage Kingdoms world. But the dragons are alien creatures. They're actually from beyond the Earth world, which is what we call our plane of existence in Savage Kingdoms. The other world is another world that sort of occasionally touches the Earth world, and there are gateways and portals and certain times of the day and year that you can cross over, which plays in really more into fairy lore, which we'll get to in a second. That was the other world, and the other world is comprised of the shadow world, or the mirror world, which is mostly where the Fae come from, also known as the fairy realms. Then the netherworld, or hell world, as it's sometimes called, or underworld, the realm of demons and dark things like that, very ancient. And then there's the overworld. The overworld is a section of the other world, also known as I think it's also known as the light world, or the celestial realm. And that's where angels live. Now, angels are, demons were first in Savage Kingdoms lore, unlike Judeo-Christian lore, or actual fact, as some believe. So demons, because darkness was first, demons were first. And so angels were about a third of them that sort of turned away from being underworld, hellish, tempting, horrible, deceitful, violent beings. They wanted to rise to a higher degree. Not necessarily to help humankind, although they can occasionally be called on to do so, just because they themselves just felt like they needed to elevate and perhaps become the real gods that men so often claim existed, or pray to, or sacrifice to, and otherwise appease. So on that note, I kind of skipped over to the Age of Gods. In the Savage Kingdom setting, it's actually not clear whether the gods really exist. In fact, it probably doesn't matter. The powers of priests come to them pretty much like anyone else learning a skill. Some might believe that through prayer and sacrifice and daily duties and ritual that they make a divine connection with something divine, and that they're given certain beliefs and objectives, and maybe that's true, but it may also just be completely psychological. So that's deliberately left open. Of course, the game master can do it either way he wants. He can definitely say no, they don't at all exist, or they definitely do, and maybe they can even take avatars or human forms occasionally. I think too much of that personally would probably break the overall atmosphere of the campaign. But hey, it's your if you buy the books, your setting, so do it as you please. But yeah, I just wanted to go back to that quick little note. So where was I? Age of Dragons still. So the dragons existed for a while, and draconic things spun off from the true dragons, like Hydra or Hydra, plural of hydras. Uh, some sea serpents remain in the dragon sea. So what else? Basilisks. Basilisks are kind of a draconic sort of spin-off wyverns or wyverns. And I think to complete the other thought I was getting to is that some believe that dragons are from beyond our world. That's why I got into that little cosmology discussion. That they have that a star fell or a meteor fell into the ocean, probably the Dragon Sea, which is why it's called that. Also because there are a lot of sea serpents there and ages past, so, or both. And so this star, this meteor, sort of incubated at the bottom of the ocean or ocean river, bottom of the sea, and perhaps spawned the dragon. So if that's true, they're that might be another reason they don't have gender. They're just beyond. They're just completely alien race. It also explains kind of their morality and their ethics, which are extremely loose, and they're very egotistical. They themselves believe they're gods. They don't believe any greater beings other than themselves. So yeah, so dragons and savage kingdoms are typically, I hate to use the word evil because it's so overused, but yeah, some of them, and also it's not very alien enough. So they're definitely pretty violent and self-centered, but their overall morality is almost more Cthulian, where it's just they don't really care. They just do what they want, and a lot of times humans and other beings are just sort of ants that they occasionally step on by accident, not really meaning to, but then if they do, they're like, whatever, it's just an ant or a human in this case. So, however, draconic cults have occurred in Savage Kingdom's history and are still around, a few of them. And the reason, and you can see the reason why, because the dragon, as dragons age, they get older and less mobile, and they will sleep for weeks or months, sometimes years. There was a really old dragon called Vonothrax that still exists. He's an ice worm, and they say he's laired, has lairs in several places in the Ice Claw Mountains. Some believe he's actually he's still asleep, like he's died in the sleep. But some believe he's still around. He just sleeps for a really long time. He's around between 400 and 500 years old. Possibly an even older dragon, over 500 years old, is Gethrax, which is his name in dragon speech, or Terran Gethrian, which is his name in the She tongue, which means he of terrible flame or he of terrible fire. So he is really old too. He used to rule a kingdom, a realm unto himself called Gethrax, because again, dragons are kind of egotistical. So he gave his own name to the realm, and he ruled over hobgoblins. In Savage Kingdoms, hobgoblins are they're like Urukai. Urukai, they're very great and massive and strong. Because there are no orcs in Savage Kingdoms, so hobgoblins sort of take that role. Uh, and then there are goblins, or goblings, as they're sometimes called in the north, and
They're like, hey, mostly like what do you think goblins are? Sneaky, always looking around, that sort of thing, sneaking about, stabbing people in the back.
so those are goblins. And the reason I bring that up is because Gethrax sort of lorded over these hobgoblins, these Urukai, as his main armies, and even had some goblins who the hobgoblins pushed around, and he would use them for scouts and spies. So as the dragon gets older, sometimes it will have humans, and in this case, hobgoblins or humanoids, to sort of be its eyes and ears in the world as it gets so old and it's not mobile anymore. So it'll have spies, and so that's how these cults start as well. As this nation called Gethrites, which still actually more or less exists in the Bloodrock Mountains. Um, so in return, the cultists are sometimes given secrets by the dragon, secret sorceries and alchemy and some forbidden lore and other and medicine and other ways, just things that man doesn't do as well, or trinkets from their hoard, great gemstones, gold, where the dragon has raided and plundered and just hoarded all this stuff together. So you can see why a dragon cult could somewhat easily form when the dragon is not feasting on its cultists. So that's the Age of Dragons. So the last paragraph of that on page 9 says, some few have whispered that a few dragons even learn to work with humankind instead of always striving against them, seeking them only for fodder or for plunder. If such was ever true, then that age had passed, for the greater part. Dragonkind was ever cruel and cunning and terrible to behold. When wolves strove against man in the wild, it was the dragon that strove with all things. And this remained true even with the giants and titans, the old gods still in the world. So that's the last paragraph. So that gave you a hint that there's also a famous dragon. Most believe he's passed because he lived for a long time, named Fu Qin, or Chinaxis, I think was his draconic name or dragon speech name. But he went by the name of Fu Qin because he was able to take human form and he walked through people, and so he's one of the few dragons that became kind of enlightened and actually actively rewarded his followers and believers instead of using them or eating them whenever they angered him or when he was hungry. So yeah, and he created these scrolls of knowledge that people are trying to seek, and they contain all this cool information that humans never knew about. A lot of it's coded, so it's like you have to puzzle it out. It's really interesting. So now we're in the Age of Fairy. So the Age of Fairy was 3,500 years ago. So after the first paragraph says, Dragonkind ruled, for the lack of a better term, for nearly 4 millennia, or so go the preserved histories of the greatest empires. And though the dragons never truly left the mortal world, nor died off from lack of procreation, they eventually retreated to the far and forlorn reaches, some seeking the mountains, some the swamps and ancient forests, and even a few back to the sea from whence they had originally crawled. As such, humankind flourished, blessed with adaptability and procreativity, as did, though more in secret, the Durgar and trolls. That's just a fair first paragraph, goes into other stuff. But that sets up the Age of Fairy. So it basically says the dragonkind is, they're starting to fade a little bit more. They're not as common as the Age of Fairy arises. And the most prominent Fae race are the Aluna She. Now, as you might know, She is a Celtic term from the real world. They were sort of elf-like, Fae beings. Often they were described as tall and sinuous and willowy until the Victorian age came and that kind of shrunk all the fairies down. But if you go back to traditional Iron Age and Dark Age fairy lore, you'll find that they're a little scarier and bigger and somewhat more closer to humans in their behavior. So the Aluna She, Aluna is a term that I created and just stuck it on the She. So Aluna She in Savage Kingdoms basically means light elf or the first elves, which were the light elves. And the reason that is a thing is because eventually, first of all, they were just the Aluna She, and then they crafted this great kingdom called Arvalendor, which is almost like an empire. They didn't really have an emperor, and they don't really look at things like imperial like that, but it was very, very, very vast. At least the size of the current present-day Laurentian Empire. And eventually, a powerful noble house rose to some power, and it overthrew the royal house of Arvalendor. This big civil war happened. Back in those days, magic flowed easier in the world, in the known world, and the Aluna She themselves were already mystical, magical beings, and so they mastered magic pretty easily. So lots of great, powerful magics and spells and things were summoned forth in this battle, and it created the Shadowlands. So the Shadowlands is this big blighted area in the kind of central northwest of the of Astagonia, which is the western continent. Big blighted wasteland. Few things there left except for ghosts, and if you're lucky, you might can find an ancient relic from Arvalindor, or unlucky because some of them are probably cursed or have some lingering horrible tainted effect upon them. Um, so yeah, so that's what happened there, and that was uh, 30, yeah, about 3,500 years ago at the beginning of the Age of Fairy. So fairy kind or fae also include. Oh yeah, so to finish that story, so after the war, Arvalindor was split into two realms: Calendoril and Lithalor. Calendoril is in the north. Is basically what was left of Arvalindor, ruled by the Light Elves, the Lunashi, and in Lithalor, the Dark Elves or the Unseelie Elves or the Dark She sort of rule in Lithalor, which is a very hidden kingdom. It's hidden by powerful glamours, and it's really hard to find. Some say it doesn't really exist. So there are other fae that sort of creeped into the world as the other world and Earth world begin to touch each other um, on occasion, and some stay here, like the Alunashi did. Um, just enjoying Earthworld, and some of them are lucky enough to cross back and forth sometimes through powerful spells. So the other fae are things like nymphs and chorids and nixies and sylphs and merfolk, the merfolk of the seas, red caps, of course, goblins or goblins, the sluagh. Red caps are really nasty with the long claws, and they violent slash mortals up, people up, animals up, but mostly uh, people because there's more power in their blood, and they slather their hats or caps in this blood, and that's why they're called red caps or chorids, and gives them extra power. So the Durgar are mentioned in this age because some believe the Durgar are more related to Fae than they are the Age of Giants and Trolls, but the other lore says that Durgar and Trolls are actually are really the same race, and they kind of split off at some point. So that might be of something of interest. All right, so we're almost getting to the Age of Man here, and then I can wrap this video up. So the last paragraph of the Age of Fairy says, "It was no surprise that eventually humankind would find itself striving against goblin kind, for often the greatest of man's realms would stretch toward the goblin-haunted hills and dark forests. Some humans sought fragile alliances with the goblinoids, using them as laborers or mercenary warriors, but most strove against them with fire and sword and spear. And thus came our present era, a time to end or begin all times. The Age of Man." So that last paragraph was more in reference to goblins about the Age of Fairy, how they sort of rose up a little bit with some little tribal realms. One still exists called Nurgle or Nurgle, and so that section kind of ended like that. So now we're at the Age of Man as we wrap up the present. The Age of Man, as it says, or the Age of Humans or mankind or humankind, is happened about five. Well, actually, the first paragraph says, though humans were first seen on the face of the mortal world over 5,000 years ago, it wasn't until just over 2 millennia past that they began to assert themselves upon their environment, impressing the gods who crafted them in older times and forcing fate to their ever-increasing wills. The first human empire was Zarkon, which was more of a rough confederacy of city-states, etc. So, it basically goes into saying that Zarkon, one of the first human civilized realms, was Zarkon, and in the southwest. And there were great 9 city-states came to power, each ruled by known in history would become later known in history as the Witch Lords. The Witch Lords were kind of the divine-blooded, or so they claimed, sorcerer kings. And so Zarkon got to power not only through pretty legitimate architecture and language and that sort of thing and writing, um, but mostly because they were really starting to dabble in alchemy and sorcery. Um, Sorcery in the sense that darker magic, almost like what I call shortcut magic, not true magic. They're having to do rituals and summon demons and blood sacrifices, and sometimes the spells don't work right and corrupt the magician himself. In fact, a lot of the times it does that. There's a price to pay with such magic, and that still exists in current day magical arts and savage kingdoms too, but back then even more so. So eventually, this confederation of city-states in the south called R rose up against Zarkon and overthrew uh, it in a huge war called the War of Light and Shadow. It lasted for 5 years, and they were just fed up with the evilness and the dark and the witch lords and their power and their taxation and just everything. But it costs both sides pretty bitterly. It cost them a lot. Zarkon is now just a blighted wasteland. It's even probably 5 times worse than the Shadowlands. With poisonous rivers, it says Zarkon now is a blighted wasteland, a peninsula, poisonous rivers, and sunless days. Um, so nobody really likes to go there. Occasionally, a cult of Zur will spring up around there, or possibly even in or Ar, very hidden. Zur was the main god of Zarkonians. He's a serpent god. Some say he was, some believe that he was so large that the 2 moons, because this world has 2 moons, were his eyes, and the sun is his was his anus. So that's how big. So the serpent wrapped around the world, and Zur possibly came from Slur, which was the Sleer, which are the serpent folks. They're sort of alien sort of god they brought with them, and so they kind of uh, corrupted humans into following Zur. I mean, they could be 2 different deities, but they seem like they're very much similar. Speaking of which, the Sleer enslaved humankind for quite a while, for almost a millennium, 900 to 1,000 years, because as mankind began, they weren't quite as developed, and the Sleer off just enslaved not all of mankind, but in the East particularly, a good 2/3 of the men's tribes were enslaved by the Sleer. Eventually, men became a little more involved. They evolved a little quicker than the Sleer, who already were kind of almost maxed out in their evolution. So eventually, humans became clever and crafty enough, and even physically strong enough to sort of eventually overthrow. So that's a whole story and video in itself. But basically, long story short, the humans of Zarkon and Ebenezuk, which was another realm that was up and coming, Ebenezuk in the north part of Imanju. So Zarkon and Ebenezuk sort of developed at the same time once they threw off the yoke of the Sleer. Other realms too began to develop. See Zaramad, which was once called the Zarian Empire. Now it's the Empire of Zaramad. Actually, the original empire sort of fell away. It was destroyed, and now only fairly recently, over the last 150 years, the new empire of Zaramad has grown to this great power. So it kind of feels it's supposed to it kind of analogs with the Persian Empire of the real world, and this empire is about even twice the size of the Laurentian Empire in the west, which is a lot like Rome, the Roman Empire. So it's becoming a big deal. Zaramad in the west, just almost about the same time, maybe a little after this point, the Rhodonian, the Rhodonites are beginning to rise up, the people of Rhodon who believe in the gods of Rhodon. And a great cataclysm happened that destroyed Rhodon, the Isle of the Gods, as history claims. And so the remaining humans were eventually, they had to kind of almost restart again. They eventually became known as the Pridonians because there was a great city they built called Pridon, the city of Pridon. And then a little bit later, in another cataclysm, about 2/3 of that city actually sank underwater. So there's kind of an Atlantis theme going on with it. Part of it still exists, they say, above water. Some even claim that people still live there in the Basilius, who was the ruler of the Pridonian Republic at some point, which were several islands and city-states that formed an alliance, still lives there in the Basilium, this great massive palace, which is probably partly destroyed. He is usually also the high priest of Pridonis, which is the god of the sea of those people. It's just by far the chief god. So that culture is developing. Taikanara, meantime, which is kind of like ancient China, is coming along also quite well, as well as Yanakan, which is like ancient Japan. Ebenezuk, as I mentioned. So, meanwhile, and then a little bit after that, realms like Brythia, Ismondos in the west start to come into being, Molovia. But of course, Molovian Empire becoming to come to power as well, also known as the Winter Kingdom. And so it's very, very dark realm. The mankind is very, very dark, but very skilled with death magics. We would like to be immortals, become vampires. So that's Molovia, also known as the Winter Kingdom. On the eastern continent of Hassan, you've got you've got Tarnia that's coming around. They were actually originally Westerners that crossed Dragon Sea. They were known as the Aragandi, I believe, tribe, and then they founded this kingdom of Tarnia, and their patron deity Tarn has sort of led them there, they believe. And then you have realms like Valnarok and Norland and Scathia, which are very Scandinavian or Viking and theme and culture. Scathia is actually fairly civilized now. It's coming along very rapidly. Norland and particularly Valnarok are still pretty brutal and savage, and honestly, they seem to sort of like it that way. And then you've got other sort of tribal realms like Kor, some of these horse cultures like Kor and Erlin, and and then there was also real quickly there was an empire called Galagadson. There was the Galagadson Empire, also known as the Empire of the Four Crowns. Called that because originally it was four kingdoms that formed an alliance. But as you imagine, after a century or so, there was a lot of squabbling, who was in charge and power struggles. So eventually an emperor was elected, and then the four kingdoms became four provinces of the empire. So, but it didn't last. I mean, it lasted a fairly good while, but not super long. Eventually, there were just too many barbarian tribes raiding, particularly from the north, but also the Tarnians started to from the west because they wanted their old lands of Galador back. So eventually, that empire just fell and got plundered and looted all the great cities and stuff from the various barbarian tribes like the Volner, the Golger, the Yuns or the Yuntillans, and the Urish, and even more civilized people, like I said, like the Tarnians, and to some degree the Ticonarans. So we're just about getting wrapped up here as I'm catching all that up. So that empire falls, and that kind of brings us. This wasn't super long ago, so the current time is the Laurentian Empire has become kind of a big deal. It was Pridonians who went northward on the main continent, founded this empire. There were men living there in tribes called the Goldari and the Latagoni and the Eridorni and the Ismandi, and they defeated most of these tribes or subjugated them into their own people and culture, taking them as slaves. But eventually over time they actually became, their offspring became legitimate free peoples for the most part. One tribe called the Ismandi actually fled these battles and crossed the Blood Rock Mountains and founded the kingdom of Ismandos, which is like ancient Spain. Yeah, so I think that about catches us up. This video went a little longer than I thought, but not too bad. So to take us to conclude the age of man and bring us to the present, the last paragraph of that says, "Thus the age of man continues, and in this new era, barely beyond the most recent cataclysm that scholar bards are calling the time of judgment, great heroes will determine the ultimate fate of humankind, and perhaps others besides. The gods are watching, waiting, ready to pronounce their doom at a time of their choosing, should they truly still exist, and only the strong-willed and valorous will prevail, or at least for now, escape their judgment." All right. Well, thanks for hanging in there, guys, for 43 minutes plus. Maybe I'll do some more of these videos. Hope maybe I won't ramble quite as long, but I think for the most part that was some pretty good stuff. Hopefully you got something out of that. Thanks for hanging with me. And yeah, so pick up Savage Kingdoms Reforged if you get a chance. Like I said, I may do some more videos about the lore. And I will talk to you guys soon. Thanks a lot. Happy adventuring.